Well, we'll get started. It's 7 o'clock. Well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to virtually see so many people here on I believe it's Tuesday night for a webinar. My name is Dan Kelting. I'm the Executive Director of the Paul Smith College Adirondack Watershed Institute. I'm here with my colleague Zoe Smith, who's Deputy Director, and our featured guest speaker, honored person for the evening, Meg Modley from the Lake Champlain Basin Program, is going to be speaking with us about aquatic invasive species. But before we get to Meg's talk, I just want to remind everybody, and for those of you that perhaps are just joining us for the first time this evening, that this presentation by Meg is part of one of 6 that are being offered through our inaugural Adirondack Water Week, and the theme is protecting the legacy of Adirondack waters. Again, started Sunday night, concluding on Friday night. And this event is organized and sponsored by the Paul Smith College Adirondack Watershed Institute, and also Northwood School based in Lake Placid. I mentioned this is the inaugural event. We plan on doing this every year with different themes and different focus. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do things, still do webinars probably because they're pretty efficient, but be more interactive, have more, we're really interested in engaging children and doing some more hands-on field-based activities with children based out of the hub, Northwoods Hub, Innovation Hub in downtown Lake Placid. So welcome everybody to this 3rd installment. I just want to show you the schedule. So we have 6 presentations. The first one was myself on Sunday night, where I talked about the history of Adirondack waters, both the natural history, which kind of set the stage, if you will, and then the major human events that have continued over a fairly short period of time, actually, to change the character of our waters as a setup for the speakers that you've been listening to for the rest of the week. We heard from Kurt Steger last night on climate change and Adirondack waters. Tonight we're hearing from Meg. And then tomorrow night we'll have Danielle Garneau from SUNY Plattsburgh talking about microplastic pollution, an emerging issue, emerging threat that folks will find very interesting. Then Brendan Wiltsey will be speaking about road salt on Thursday night. And then we're going to wrap it up on Friday night with Zoe Smith is going to lead a discussion, a panel of folks to talk about community action to protect clean water. All of these other talks, we're really talking about threats to water with some suggestions and action, but we really want to leave folks with some tools and things that they can do, that you can do to protect clean water. So we're going to end that with that particular activity on Friday night. So before I go any further, I want to introduce and have Zoe Smith talk a little bit about how we want you to interact with us tonight in terms of asking questions of Meg for her presentation. Go ahead, Zoe.
Thanks, Dan, and welcome everyone. It's great to see we have 53 people joining us tonight. It's great to see all the great participation and the interest in this topic. So we will be having a Q&A session at the end of Meg's talk, but you're welcome to submit a question at any point. And to do that, there is an icon at the bottom of your screen that says Q&A. If you press that, you can type in a question either anonymously or you can have your name attached to it. Or if you're more familiar, you can use the chat function, which is another icon at the bottom of your screen. It says chat. And you can ask a question through the chat function as well. If you're using an iPad, these icons might be at the top of your screen instead of the bottom of your screen. So Dan will be facilitating the Q&A at the end, and we'll get to those questions. Hopefully we'll get to all of them, although we haven't been able to get to all of them. There's been so many great questions. So we'll do our best to get to your question tonight, but feel free to submit that question anytime, but we will take those at the end of Meg's talk.
Great, thank you, Zoe. I'm going to stop sharing and Meg, you can go ahead and pull your screen up. So while Meg is getting ready, I want to introduce her. Meg is actually, so I've been working here at Paul Smith for 17 years, and Meg was one of the first professional acquaintances I made early in my time here at Paul Smith. And it's always a delight to be able to interact with Meg. Meg is currently, and has been for a while, the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator for the Lake Champlain Basin Program. where she coordinates a variety of management efforts to prevent the introduction and spread of aquatic invasive species in the Lake Champlain Basin. Meg has a BA in Environmental Studies and Geology and a Master's of Arts in Public Administration, both from the University of Vermont. She does a lot of things, a variety of things, but her work has included the development of the Lake Champlain Basin Aquatic Invasive Species Rapid Response Action Plan, implementing the Lake Champlain Basin Aquatic Nuisance Species Management Plan, supervising the Lake Champlain Boat Launch Stewards Program, which this summer has been quite challenging, just like ours has been challenging, and also working a lot with local partners, both local and regional partners, on education and outreach campaigns related to aquatic invasive species. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Meg Modley, talk about aquatic invasive species. Meg, go ahead, Meg.
Thank you, Dan. Well, my first two things that I noticed here is, one, I'm wearing the same shirt in this picture that I am in the picture that you got of me for the profiles of the speakers. So I feel like I'm wearing the right uniform anyway, and you've slightly dated me, Dan. Yes, I have been at the Lake Champlain Basin Program and New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission for 17 years. So welcome, thank you for joining us this evening. We are going to dive right into the topic of aquatic invasive species. And I have so much love for this area of interest, but I do also focus my time on water quality and other research projects. It's just really nice to have so much dedicated time to working on aquatic invasive species. So to start off, we're going to get right into the definition of what is an invasive species. Invasive species are plants, animals, and pathogens that are non-native to the region, meaning they haven't been here since pre-European settlement. So they're newly introduced in our human memory, and they have to cause some kind of harm. So invasives have those two qualifiers: not from here and have to cause harm. And the type of harm that they can cause is economic harm, ecological harm, or harm to human health. And sometimes it's pretty difficult to measure those harms, which is why a number of non-native species are not moved into the invasive category until we can measure a harm. These organisms produce self-sustaining populations. Once they're introduced, they usually take off really quickly. We have a few photographs on this slide. In the lower left, you see a dense bed of Eurasian water milfoil, which is a very common species in the Adirondack region and across the Northeast. Unfortunately, it is very good at hybridizing with native species, and there's another invasive variable leaf milfoil that it can also hybridize with. So we are not strangers to Eurasian water milfoil in the Adirondack region. In the center photograph is a picture of a fishing line or a downrigger that is covered with hundreds of an invasive crustacean called the spiny water flea, which was first found in Lake Champlain in 2014, but was previously detected in Lake George and a number of other water bodies across the Adirondack Park. So this one rarely occurs in our waters in this area, but it is a good candidate and it prefers deeper lakes, some colder temperatures. And then on the right is the invasive zebra mussel. Lake Champlain is host to many zebra mussels. They were documented entering the southern end of Lake Champlain in the 1990s and colonized the entirety of the lake within a decade from south to north. So that is your definition of invasive species, and I'm going to bring up a few other definitions of other species just in comparison to help clarify this definition. So native species are species that we know to grow here. There are seed banks of them in the soil. They usually grow and don't overtake the landscape necessarily. They've reached some kind of an equilibrium within the environment here. Non-native species, again, are often referred to exotic, introduced, or alien species. And again, they're not here on their own accord. Usually they're introduced, meaning we plant a certain type of apple species, or we plant a certain type of flower species in our garden. And luckily they don't reproduce so quickly that they become able to cause harm and shift into that invasive category. So the invasive species, again, the non-native, and they cause economic, human health, or ecological harm. And then there's this other term we use, which is a nuisance species. And a nuisance species really can refer to any kind of species that we just don't like as humans. So oftentimes people talk about weeds, or the weeds could be native and just growing prolifically. They could be non-native, they could be invasive. So nuisance is really a qualifier to describe an organism that we don't like. And then I often get the question of, why are some non-native species invasive? Well, some of the non-natives, when they're introduced into our region, lack their natural predators from their home environment. So they're able to reproduce and grow very quickly. They often, or they can bring parasites with them that can affect other native species. So oftentimes when we have the introduction of, say, a new fish, it might also be bringing with it some pathogens or some parasites that can affect our native species that are residing in our lakes. And some of them are really well suited. We have to distinguish between plants and animals here. For plants, they are often able to reproduce many seeds and reproduce both early and through different means, and have fewer requirements for growth. So with aquatic plants, for example, we often see the invasive species growing earliest in the season. They're monopolizing the light and the nutrients in the water column, and they can crowd out or shade out native plants. With invasive animals, oftentimes with say the spiny water flea, they have greater tolerances for pH or salinity or dissolved oxygen, and they can reproduce both sexually and asexually. So these are some competitive advantages that make these non-natives shift into the invasive category, meaning that they're able to displace or harm our environment, our economy, or human health. Many of the invasive species we're familiar with are considered generalists, meaning they can colonize many different types of habitat. And again, they just have that upper hand over any of the native species that we have in our ecosystem. Some of them can even produce toxins that are harmful, and some of the terrestrial species or some of the terrestrial insects that we might be familiar with in the invasive category do produce toxins that can cause burns or blisterings on human arms, or can cause people to get sick in other ways. I threw these pictures in earlier this April, actually late March, believe it or not. I took a photograph in a bay on Lake Champlain. My son was in the water. It was very, very cold. But the first two plants that we saw on the left-hand picture are the invasive curly leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil. And they had grown to the point that they were being dislodged from their roots with the wind and the wave action, and they were blowing in on the shore as early as late March and early April. And then on the right-hand side is just a sample that was collected by a boat launch steward off of a boat later in the season. So late July, early August. And it has some examples of native plants that tend to come up later in the season. So early in the season, we're really seeing more aquatic invasive species dominating the ecosystem with first growth, first reproduction. And then later in the season, we tend to get a lot of questions, especially from our boat launch stewards, about, I haven't seen this plant. What organism is this? Is this non-native? Is this invasive? And it's typically a native species. The little circular plant floating that has the little strings descending from it is a native large duckweed. We have a native Vallisneria or eelgrass, and Elodea or waterweed. So those organisms do tend to be more prevalent later in the season. I wanted to sort of set the geographic context of the threats and the pressures that aquatic invasive species, face when we're trying to prevent them from moving across the landscape. And so the red outline is the Lake Champlain watershed, and the blue in the middle is Lake Champlain, which flows north into the St. Lawrence Seaway. In addition to that, and I think more relevant for this talk, I've sort of superimposed the blue line here for the Adirondack Park. And the point here is that although we see our New England states and the 3 provinces of Ontario, Quebec, and New Brunswick, these organisms do not respect political boundaries. They're more likely to follow range and temperatures, as well as waterways. And in particular, the Adirondack Park is surrounded by some pretty significant waterways that have large numbers of non-native invasive species present. And that includes the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Great Lakes, the Lake Champlain, and the Hudson River system. So when we're thinking about how we manage these organisms, it's really critical that we're working together interstate, internationally on spread prevention programs and education and outreach and consistent messaging, because these organisms are likely to show up across the Northeast. There are a number of pathways through which aquatic invasive species can move across the landscape, and the largest number of known introductions to this Northeast region of the United States is through ballast water exchange. So lots of international cargo ships take on ballast to steady their boat in the water when they take on cargo. In their home port, they transit the entirety of the Atlantic Ocean, come into the Great Lakes, and after they have onloaded or offloaded additional cargo, they may be discharging some of that ballast water into the Great Lakes. And that was originally thought to be the greatest way in which aquatic organisms, plants, animals, and pathogens entered the Great Lakes system. From there, it's easy for the swimmers and the floaters to move through man-made canalways into other bodies of water and cross some of the watershed boundaries. But unfortunately, humans are known to accelerate or assist in the spread of these aquatic hitchhikers, and often it's completely unintentional. Folks will plant beautiful flowers or ornamental species in their water gardens, and you can imagine in a situation like Tropical Storm Irene or Lee, where we have extensive flooding, that there are escapes from these water gardens and they're flushed into our local rivers or lakes, and from there they can just take off. Many are familiar with the extensive damage from Tropical Storm Irene and Lee and the spread of Japanese knotweed along most of the river corridors throughout our Northeast region, which is pretty devastating, because that riparian species can grow in such dense monostands and really dominate the sides of riverbanks and destabilize them, which is unfortunate. We also have a number of roadways. That's a popular way in which seeds and other hitchhikers on boats and trailers, when they're being moved across the landscape, can penetrate into places that are largely otherwise protected, like the Adirondack Park. So you can see the roadway corridor map shows sort of the pulsing system of how organisms can be transported into the heart of the Adirondacks on our recreational equipment. Some people often will have plants or amphibians or even reptiles growing, pets in their homes. And occasionally, I like to call it the free Nemo phenomenon. Those plants or animals will get too large for their cage, or their owners can no longer care for them, and their best wish for their animals is to release them into the environment. Unfortunately, those organisms can sometimes get out and reproduce and cause damage. And it's been surprising, maybe, but I guess not completely unusual that we find something like a dead sea starfish in Lake Champlain. That doesn't make any sense because Lake Champlain was a sea over 13,000 years ago. So finding that is really an indication that people are dumping aquarium. We've found pacu and other warm water species from South America and our tributaries. Luckily, these organisms don't survive in the environment and they can't overwinter due to temperatures, but for other organisms, they are able to reproduce and survive. So I touched on canals already, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. But we also need to think about the clothes that we wear, our tivas, our dogs' life jackets. Those are places where water in early life stages or plants or mud can get stuck and moved around from one place to another. Another common issue is fill or mulch material, beach supplements with sand, and any place that we cause some significant disturbance and additive is an opportunity for invasive species to take advantage of or be introduced and do quite well. And then of course, New York State, as well as a number of other states, have a don't transport fireword regulation that's really targeting those forest pests and pathogens and trying to prevent them from moving inland to the heart of the protected forest ways. There are some natural pathways by which invasive species can move across the landscape. Birds and other animals may ingest these plants and excrete them on the landscape, and that is definitely one way that some of these organisms can move around, as well as the wind and waterways can carry plants and seeds. So here is a fairly popular figure that we use in our State of the Lake report that outlines the pressures that are exerted on the region from surrounding water bodies. So in the Adirondack Park, you're surrounded by 187 known non-native and invasive species, 122 in the Hudson, 51 in Lake Champlain, and 87 in the St. Lawrence River. And many of us are very aware that people move their equipment, their boats, all of their angling gear back and forth from these systems into the Adirondack Park and the Northeast region very quickly. And they do it over and over again. And so that pressure on our system is fairly significant. And we have spread prevention programs, including the Boat Launch Steward program, targeted at the highest risk boat launches where we see the greatest use from people coming from the most diverse number of lakes that have other invasive species present in them, and then come to Lake Champlain or come to an Adirondack lake, and then outbound traffic going to other lakes that may be uninvaded is a huge concern on Lake Champlain. Because we have 51 known non-native and invasive species, we have stopped and saved some species from entering Lake Champlain, like the quagga mussel or hydrilla, but we have those 51 species that we're trying to prevent from spreading to other inland bodies of water. So we're very connected, and here you can see that we have built man-made canals. The Erie Canal really connects the Hudson River system west over into the Great Lakes, and to the north, the Hudson system is connected to Lake Champlain through the Champlain Canal system. And then to our north, though Lake Champlain flows north and over the Richelieu River Falls, that prevents a number of organisms from swimming upstream or floating upstream over falls getting into Lake Champlain. But that Chambly Canal exists, which is a bypass that's open for fish to swim, for plants to be entrained, for pathogens to move and be carried across these watershed boundaries. So these primary points of entry are really identified as ballast water entry and then movement through canals and waterways. And those, when we're looking at all of the different pathways that invasive species move, are the two most prominent for introduction and movement around the region. And then we get more specific with overland transport on boats and trailers. So we are working very hard to address the canals as pathways, and we're funding a lot of research to evaluate how many organisms are moving back and forth through the systems and what kind of invasive species barriers could be implemented in these systems that would allow for traffic, recreational traffic at least, to pass, but possibly limit the number of invasive species and the types of taxa that can move through these systems. So we like to say that our volunteers and our boat launch stewards and the communities and the watershed organizations, these are the folks who are really the boots on the ground, who are out there every day observing what's happening in their watersheds and really fighting the battle. This is a picture of the southern end of Lake Champlain, and it is matted with an invasive annual plant called water chestnut. Yes, it does have little water chestnuts in it that you can eat, but they're not the ones that you would typically have in any kind of ethnic foods. So they're pretty bland. But the biggest challenge of water chestnut is when it grows in these dense mats that are often referred to as putting greens, that they're using up so many resources that there's nearly no dissolved oxygen beneath these mats, and therefore very few organisms can live underneath these mats. So this is a huge ecological impact right off the bat. On top of that, it's a huge economic impact, because if you have a boat, or if you're trying to fish, or bless you, if you're trying to swim through that, that's going to be nearly impossible. So this definitely impedes with our human use and enjoyment of water bodies. The good news about water chestnut is it is an annual plant, and if you can harvest it before its nutlet drops into the sediment, you can start to reduce the population if you manage it year after year. Unfortunately, those little nutlets do have viability in the sediment for a number of years, so you have to consistently harvest some areas. And we're currently spending over $500,000 just to manage the southern end of Lake Champlain's water chestnut population alone. It's a huge success story. We've pushed the populations very far south, and eventually we will be able to cease our mechanical harvesting and really just manage these infestations by hand harvesting efforts. So talking about the types of tools that we have to manage aquatic invasive species once they're introduced and once they become established, we have somewhat of a limited toolbox. We have physical means. All of these typically require permits and review, which is appropriate. We want to make sure we're not disturbing any native, rare, or threatened or endangered species in the act of managing aquatic invasive plants. There is the tedious work of diving underwater and hand harvesting selected plants when you have small populations of say, Eurasian water milfoil. There have been great examples of small populations managed by scuba, by hand pulling, that have been able to eradicate. And eradication is a tricky word. We usually say a population is considered eradicated if it is monitored for 3 years and there's no regrowth or return after those 3 years. So most of what we do is managing to contain and control spread. So in addition to hand pulling, there are mechanical harvesters that can cut plants. Annual plants can be cut like water chestnut without leading to any additional spread of the plant, because it does not grow by fragmentation. Unfortunately, Eurasian water milfoil and some of the other invasive plants we're concerned about do spread by fragmentation. So if you're just cutting them and not removing the stem or the seed bank, you're going to be at it for quite a long time. It's much like mowing the grass. There are ways to suction harvest using diver-assisted suction harvesting. And then there's some matting techniques using much like a very thick pond liner that you can put down over dense beds of aquatic vegetation. And basically through eliminating light and oxygen to the source, you can eliminate that bed. It's very physically intensive to do this, but it is appropriate in certain areas. We do have a number of chemicals, both pesticides and herbicides, that can be used for aquatic plants and for fish population control. It's very difficult to get these uses permitted right now, especially in New York and in Vermont. We're looking for an integrated approach for management, meaning using a number of different tools in the toolbox so that you don't have to treat the entirety of a lake with a chemical to eliminate either a plant or a fish species. But those tools are available to us, and we do use them when it's appropriate. There are biological controls that are developed through decades of research of examining what kind of organisms like weevils or moths might predate other animals in their home territories. So it takes a lot of work for our national and our federal partners to go and do this research. They have to isolate and treat these in a laboratory setting for a number of years, and then do very small controls and very small areas out in the open, and then decide whether or not it's a tool that can be used widespread. However, in a number of these cases where we've worked on purple loosestrife management or Eurasian water milfoil management with beetles or weevils, these organisms will eat invasive species that we want to target, but if there are other food sources available that they prefer, they'll probably go eat those too. So it's not as though you just introduce a bug that has one meal on its menu that it will eat. So, and every lake and every wetland has a different ecological makeup of and diversity of species and quantity of those species. So these biological controls really need to be used in concert with other types of control mechanisms and techniques. There are some cultural management techniques like prescribed grazing or burning, where animals like goats are used to eat certain types of terrestrial plants, or we use prescribed burning to treat some kind of shrubs that we can control with fire, so that we can reclaim and revegetate with native species. So, and then of course there's the do nothing option. That is an option. It has an unknown outcome, and often it's not something that the communities in this region believe is acceptable. So if there's a management tool available and resources to manage invasive species, particularly in the Adirondack region, we have been pursuing those management technologies. The ecological impacts to native species are very diverse, and it can be really easy or very difficult to measure those impacts. We do know that invasive species are the second leading cause of the loss of biodiversity, second only to habitat destruction. So I want to give you a few examples of what might be easy or what might be difficult to measure. In the center picture, you have a hand holding a native mussel from Lake Champlain, and surrounding the lip of the mussel is a number of invasive zebra mussels. So here it's pretty clear to see that zebra mussels aren't actively eating this mussel. They're not seeking it out, other than it's a hard substrate and it's a place to conveniently grow. But if they can encrust the whole opening on that native mussel, the mussel is no longer able to feed, and it will become less fit and likely die, or be quote unquote suffocated. So that's an impact that's pretty easy to see, an ecological impact that's easy to see. However, we have the introduction of other organisms like the spiny water flea on that fishing line picture, where these organisms, when they come in, it's really hard to see the impacts that they're causing. But luckily, we have a long-term monitoring program that has been documenting the different types of phytoplankton and the quantities of those phytoplankton throughout the water column in Lake Champlain. So we have pre and post invasion data that actually shows huge shifts in those phytoplankton communities right after the spiny water flea invasion. So that would be something that would be very difficult to see the ecological impact. There might be an economic impact or a human impact, because when these organisms really are prolific, it's correlated with water temperature. When where they're resting eggs that are living in the sediment over the winter hatch out, they reproduce both sexually and asexually. The females can clone themselves on their back and hatch themselves, which is really quite fantastic. And it's a great competitive advantage. And these organisms move up and down in the water column, and they're able to predate upon most of the other phytoplankton species. They're quick, they're fast, they're aggressive, they have a big appetite. But luckily, because we've had this long-term monitoring data, we're able to show that there was a negative impact ecologically from the introduction of this species. And then in the upper right-hand corner is a die-off of a landlocked population of alewife in Lake Champlain. Alewife are native to the ephemeral tributaries along the Atlantic seaboard of the United States, but in a landlocked population, they tend to grow in excessive numbers. They have been documented to displace some of our native smelt species in different areas of the lake. And unfortunately, if you're a salmonid, a fish or a trout, you would be eating a diet very rich in alewife because they're so abundant and they're easy for you to eat. However, when you eat that many alewife, it prevents the transfer of your thiamine vitamin B to your eggs or your offspring, and it can cause early mortality syndrome in those salmonid species. So there are first and second-hand impacts there that we've been able to measure only because we have existing monitoring programs that weren't designed to measure these things. But as a consequence of introductions, we've been able to document some of the ecological impacts of these aquatic invasive species within the Lake Champlain ecosystem and in other lakes in the region. Quickly, some of the impacts of aquatic invasive plants. Again, I think we've been over this already, but just decreasing the diversity of native plant species by growing early, by growing often, by growing through different means, decreasing the availability of light and oxygen for other species because they grow early and often, growing in very dense beds, which makes it difficult to recreate and can actually raise the temperature and the pH in some of our shallow bodies of water. There are quite a number of known impacts of the aquatic invasive plants. And what we really come back to is that it really hurts our economy. We are a tourism-driven economy in the Adirondack and Vermont region of the country. Many people who come to enjoy our areas are often here to be on or near or under a body of water. And we know that there are national impacts of aquatic invasive species. And some of the ways that they are impacting our economy are in ways like the invasive zebra mussel can clog water intake pipes. So if you have a camp on the shore and zebra mussels are clogging your water intake pipe, you're gonna have to treat that every year or maybe multiple times a year. Or if you're trying to run a fish hatchery that uses Lake Champlain water, you're gonna have to treat that intake pipe frequently because the zebra mussels will grow in and restrict the amount of water coming into your facility. They also encrust historic shipwrecks, which are visited by scuba divers. They can cut the feet of swimmers. They have a lot of negative impacts that we can tie back to our economy. And as a result, for example, with water chestnut, as you can see on Lake Champlain, we've had reduced water quality. That can be a deterrent to tourism and the economy. We have reduced productivity across the suite of terrestrial and aquatic invasive plants, but we have reduced productivity of forestry, fisheries, agricultural, and rangelands across the United States. And if you're trying to boat or recreate or fish, swim where there are dense beds of vegetation that are invasive, that is a deterrent and can impact your property values. So we have lots of impacts, and it also is quite a strain on the local community because often watershed organizations are stressed and do not have a lot of resources and may be dumping in their lake fees into managing sort of incessant populations of Eurasian water milfoil or a new Asian clam infestation. One of our partners, the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, conducted an economic evaluation study that was focused on 8 species, so just 8. And they noted that in the Adirondack region, over $4 million is being spent on invasive species management and monitoring in the Adirondacks, and the estimated cost of these species impacts is somewhere between $48 and $53 million annually to tourism and the economy in the region. And then they did a deeper dive to look at what are the impacts of those invasive species on the local property owners, meaning have they seen or could they see any decreased value in their property associated with thick growth of aquatic vegetation or an invasive fish or mussel. And they estimated, this research estimated between $4 and $9 million of property value loss due just to these 8 species alone. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about another pathway that is near and dear to my heart, addressing overland transport of these aquatic hitchhikers on recreational watercraft, trailers, etc. And we have a lot of literature that supports that there are new introductions or newly found introductions next to or at boat launches at water bodies across the country, across the world. So we have a lot of documentation that this is often unintentional, meaning the boat owner is not intending to move a plant or a pathogen or a fish from one body of water to another, but simply by not knowing how to clean, drain, and dry their watercraft and recreational equipment, they might be unintentionally moving these organisms. And when I say fish, pathogen, or plant, I mean, those seem like pretty evident things that you would be able to see. But oftentimes these organisms, their early life stages are invisible to the naked eye. So we have to think about not only the mud and the visible plants or fish or minnow in the bilge water, but we have to think about the eggs of those organisms and the early life stages, the veligers, the juveniles of these organisms that are invisible to the naked eye. So that's why we focus a lot on water and making sure that we're not moving water from bilges or motors from one body of water to another. And the really great thing here is that no one needs to be able to identify aquatic invasive species, because whether it's native or non-native or invasive, or whether you think it's a nuisance or not, we don't want to move it from one body of water to another. All we need to know is that we need to take it off, clean, drain, and dry our equipment, and not move organisms or water from one body of water to another. So here's a fairly egregious picture of a boat that has aquatic vegetation impinged between the boat and the trailer, hanging off of the license plates, the wheel wells, the motor propeller. So this is a fairly easy candidate for let's remove these plants. That would be an easy first step here. We do follow the science, and what the science tells us is that by supporting boat launch steward programs or watercraft inspection and decontamination programs, we are really over 88% effective at removing aquatic plants from boats and trailers and other equipment. But when it comes to small-bodied organisms or organisms that may not be visible to the naked eye, we still, with technology, with high-pressure hot water, we are able to effectively remove 91% of those organisms. And that's simply by spraying down the exterior of watercraft that may be encrusted with zebra mussels or mud or something that you can't quite identify or feels rough or sandy to the touch, with a high pressure, meaning about 1800 PSI, and hot water, meaning about 140 degrees Fahrenheit temperature water, for a duration of time to remove and kill the organisms on the exterior of the watercraft. But the interior of the watercraft also has a lot of compartments. So bilge water, fishing wells, ballast water tanks, these areas can easily be flushed with low pressure, slightly lower temperature, 120 degrees Fahrenheit temperature water for a duration of time that also will flush out and eliminate roughly 91% of those organisms. So the science is telling us that putting this emphasis on spread prevention and decontaminating high-risk vessels is really worth our effort. To go back to highlighting the Adirondack Park and some of the data from the programs that the Adirondack Watershed Institute runs. This is a compilation of the boat launch steward data over a number of years from 2015 to 2018. This data highlights, as you can see, all these arrows coming into the Adirondack Park are showing the most commonly visited body of water previous to entering an Adirondack lake. So the 6 lakes that were most popular over those 4 years of data were the Hudson River, which, as we know, is home to 122 known non-native and invasive species. Saratoga Lake, unfortunately, has a number of known non-native and invasives. The Atlantic Ocean, the St. Lawrence River, Lake Ontario, and the Great Lakes, and the Mohawk River. So these are pretty intense pressures of repeat traffic that are coming from these external sources of known invaded water bodies, and they're moving overland quickly, and they're doing it repetitively coming into the Adirondack Park. So that pressure is real. But the good news is that when we have targeted stewardship programs on the launches that receive the greatest number of boat visitors, and that we're documenting the last body of water visited, we can really prioritize where to station our limited resources across the Adirondack Park, such that the boat launch stewards will really do the most towards spread prevention and reducing that risk of spread of invasive species. Anyone who's ever worked on invasive species spread prevention or management has at some point or another seen a graphic, this graphic in particular, which reviews the amount of area that becomes infested, the time in which it takes for organisms to take off and then grow to populations, and the amount of cost that can be incurred over that time and the area of infestation, such that it's very unusual unless you have a very well-oiled volunteer monitoring program that you're able to intercept and detect aquatic invasive species in that first sort of scattered location time frame. So really early on, where not a lot of areas invaded, and there are just a few organisms, and maybe you can get in with a curtain and quarantine off an area for management. Unless you have people who really know what they're looking for and look for it very frequently, that's unusually not the case. Unfortunately, most populations are found a little later in the invasion curve. And at that point, it becomes much more difficult to eliminate that population. You might be able to contain it. And then as you get further along, there's just trying to prevent the spread by targeting the highest use areas and by targeting spread prevention programming. So this is just a good graphic to keep in mind that early on in the invasion, with our management tools, we're able to do quite a lot, but as the infestation gets too large and is detected too late, it will cost us literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to manage and could be a decade plus endeavor to effectively contain and control. So public awareness usually starts much later in the invasion curve because they're not typically looking for something. So once the zebra mussels really started to colonize the shorelines of Lake Champlain, that's when people will begin to notice it, because it might cut up their feet when they're going to recreate on the beach or go swimming in the water. And at that point, there's really not much that can be done to control that species in Lake Champlain at that time. So early detection and rapid response are really critical here. When we have a few organisms, there's stuff that we can do really quickly. We have experts poised and ready to respond that can really get out there in the field and contain and hopefully possibly eradicate an infestation. But once it gets very large, it's unruly and it's very difficult, or management is unlikely. So those keys, prevention, early detection, and rapid response, is what is really essential for successful control. New York is really well poised with a number. They have 8 partnerships for regional invasive species management. And these different areas of the state are organized through New York DEC, but they are in touch with all of their local partners and watershed organizations so that they're out and effectively communicating with the public about spread prevention and management projects. The Adirondack Watershed Institute is the recipient of a 5-year, $9 million grant from New York DEC to continue this great work across the landscape. And as you can see, last year there were 72 boat launch stewards and 27 decontamination stations across the park with the introduction of the Adirondack Welcome Center decontamination station, which is really wonderful because boats can get inspected and decontaminated right off the thruway before they even enter the heart of the park. DEC put into effect in June of 2014, some regulations, but just on their launches to help prevent the spread of invasives by requiring folks inspect and clean and drain and dry before they launch and after they retrieve. And luckily that was followed in 2016 by a statewide regulation that prevents people from launching unless they take reasonable precautions, which include removing plants, eliminating water, cleaning and draining and drying. So in conclusion, invasive species do have tremendous economic and environmental impacts. Many of these ways in which these organisms move across the landscape are associated with human activities. Prevention and early response are critical, and volunteer efforts are really essential to help us inventory and control those populations that we're finding. And although people are part of the problem, they're definitely part of the solution. And we always say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So working with people on their behavior change to clean, drain, and dry their boats and equipment is what we're out there to do in education. And just as a closing comment here, I was very fortunate to be at a press conference today where we funded a local artist to develop this beautiful invasive species interpretation sail that will be sailed out of the Lake Champlain Sailing Community Center on the Burlington waterfront for the next 3 years to highlight the threat of aquatic invasive species and that they should be stopping aquatic hitchhikers by clean, draining, and drying. So that was a really exciting event today, and I hope you get to come to the Burlington waterfront and see this beautiful sail. Thank you so much.
I wish we could clap. I mean, I'll clap like that. Great job, Meg. It was a very, very good presentation. A lot of interest, lots of questions. So we'll dive right into it. And I've got some in the chat. I've got some in the Q&A. I think I'll go through the chat ones first, so I can try to keep myself organized. But the first question, that's a two-part question related to biological control, and so specifically focused on the triploid grass carp. And so the question. The first question is our triploid grass carp being employed to control milfoil? If not, why not? And then the second part is are there any unintended impacts of introduction of these organisms to control milfoil?
Great questions. Yes, triploid grass carp are being used in different parts of the country. They have been used in this region. Unfortunately, the research has not been as strong to support how many of the fish you need per acre of infested area, because they will eat not all plants, but quite a variety of plants, so not just your target species. And the triploid part of grass carp has turned out not to work so great. Occasionally, even though they are altered so that they're not able to reproduce, some of them are able to reproduce, so that alteration either didn't work or one of the fish was missed in some way. And so there have been escapes, and we are closely tracking and watching for grass carp escapes. So they have been used in the past. I think in some states in the Northeast, they are being used, but most managers are holding back a bit to learn more about the number or the pressure that you would need to effectively manage a population.
Thank you. There's one more question related to specific management. Here we're switching to chemicals. So big question, what are the risks associated with using herbicides and pesticides in and around waterways?
Ooh, that is a really big one. In short, there are water quality impacts that are of concern for humans, for the environment. The benefits of using some of these chemicals have been very heavily researched and studied and have very targeted effects, meaning some of the negative effects of using chemicals is that some non-target species can be impacted. Some of the positive points for using certain chemicals is that they have been so researched that they have very few non-target impacts. So in a case where you might have a very ecologically sensitive area and something very significant to protect, you might take a risk at using a certain type of chemical or herbicide in an area to control something before it gets out of control and impacts the greater area. But unfortunately, I mean, that's really a case-by-case situation. And every year we're learning about new products that are coming onto the market that are getting more targeted. So they're heavily researched, but there can be some non-target and human health impacts that we need to be very aware of.
Okay, thanks, Meg. We have a participant from the Catskills, and so they're interested in knowing, are they curious to know if any of these invasives that you talked about tonight, Meg, are also located in the lakes in the Catskill region?
Absolutely, yes. So while I focused on the major waterways and the lakes and the Lake Champlain Basin and the Adirondack Park, yes, these species, and we work very closely with our Mid-Atlantic panel states on their management of species, and they're often the folks, they're our canary in the coal mine for organisms that are moving north with temperature resistance and tolerances. So yes, and most of the species that we have unfortunately exist in the Catskill region.
Thanks, Meg. So we have a question from an APIP volunteer. All right.
Awesome.
So first an observation. So I'm seeing more heart-shaped leaves among the water shield. Wondering about European frogbit. Leaves are individual, but stems are twined. Not rosetta leaves, no flowers. So wondering what it is and whether, and also when does European frogbit flower? So question about whether they're seeing European frogbit or perhaps something else.
Awesome. Okay, so send pictures to me and to Dan, please. They do flower. They tend to flower. It's all temperature dependent again, but they tend to flower in late July and early August. So around now, I was out 2 weeks ago and saw flowering European frogbit in Lake Champlain. The key for European frogbit is that it's free floating. Its stem is not connected down into the sediment. So if it's a heart-shaped leaf and it's sort of free floating on the surface, and it does flower, those would be your indications there. But send us photographs and we'd love to take a look at them. Thanks,
Meg. Here's talk about lack of resources to control our organisms, and so this person was really curious about where Lake Champlain gets $500,000 to manage water chestnut.
That's a great question. We work with our congressional folks in New York and Vermont, and we work with our federal agencies and partners. And so much of what we do is leveraging resources and finding programs that can support this work. So the funding that comes to manage water chestnut in the southern end of Lake Champlain is largely secured by Senator Leahy through the Army Corps of Engineers and their Aquatic Plant Research and Control Program. And they send a roughly $500,000 to Vermont to manage water chestnut on the New York and Vermont sides of the southern end of Lake Champlain. That's that particular source of funding, but we work largely with the Great Lakes Fishery Commission, with the Environmental Protection Agency, with the National Park Service, and with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to bring resources in to help implement our management plan for water quality improvement in this region.
Thanks, Meg. Here's I think a very thought-provoking and challenging question. It's a good one. So there seems to be an inevitability to invasives in the Adirondacks. Is it reasonable to view efforts to manage invasives as managing the rate of growth? If so, where should the effort be directed?
That's a great question. So, I mean, I'll go back to an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Yes, these organisms will move across the landscape, but we as humans are largely aiding in their movement. And there is good news out there. The International Maritime Organization passed ballast water regulations, and now all of these international ships have to do a full ballast water exchange in the middle of the ocean, meaning that they're taking on very high salinity water, meaning that the organisms they take on their home port will not likely survive in the Great Lakes region. There are steps like that, including other preventative measures to inspect incoming shipments, cargo shipments into our ports to make sure that there's no illegal trade of organisms. But it all takes money and effort and awareness. So yes, these organisms will continue to move into our region, but we can slow them down and give our environment and our economies a buffer of absorption, so that if we let down our guard, there could be an onslaught and sort of a choke of an influx of all of these organisms to our region, and we would likely be overwhelmed. And I think that it is worth the effort to really prevent the spread and to evaluate each situation. Is it realistic to consider eradication or containment or spread prevention, and really raise awareness and make sure that people are understanding that their behavior and their everyday activities can contribute to preventing the spread and introduction of invasive species.
That's a great answer. I just would add just one anecdote from our area. So the St. Regis chain, which Paul Smith College is on, is free of aquatic invasive species. It's had a stewardship program in place for 21 years. And so, but we're surrounded by lakes that have invasive species in them to the north, south, and the east. So it's highly probable, if we didn't have the spread prevention program, that these lakes would be equally invaded. So it's a real good case for that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, as Meg was saying. All right, so Silver Lake in Perry, New York currently has toxic algal blooms growing at a rapid rate. Although the algae has grown so large due to runoff water with pesticides from farms. Would this still be considered, would this algae be considered an invasive species?
We do get that question. We'd have to look at the different types of organisms that are actually present in that. I'm guessing it's a cyanobacteria bloom, and something that's not well understood, and we're trying to learn more about it globally, is what makes cyanobacteria toxic, because not all cyanobacteria blooms are toxic. You're not going to wait to find out, which is why we have these tiered alert systems where if a certain density is observed, we tell folks to get out of the water. Mostly you just don't want to come into contact with your skin or ingest it or have your animals swim and then lick their fur if it's a neurodegenerative type of toxin. But in some cases, you know, these cyanoblooms are not toxic. Regardless, we don't want them, and they're an indication of increased nutrient loading into our lakes. So we'd have to look at the makeup of the different species within the bloom that you're talking about. But people have asked you, do you think these can be considered invasive? And I think the jury's still a little bit out on that. If we do some sediment coring and look for some of these organisms in our region, I think we're going to find that, and I think it has been found that a number of them have been here forever.
We're going to ask two more questions because we're just after 8, but just two more. And so this one's interesting. Can native species also control the invasive non-native species? If so, to what extent can they be controlled by naturally occurring species?
Ooh, that's a case by case or species by species issue, but we have seen some of our native species, for example, adapt to eating the invasive zebra mussel in Lake Champlain. We have drum and sheephead and some other fish species that have really strong jaws that are able to crush the shells and get the inside tissue of the zebra mussels. They're not going to be able to do it at a rate that's going to control the population, but we're seeing adaptations of native species in terms of either cohabitating or learning to predate or use other invasives as food sources.
Great, thank you. This last question, very practical. Does a car wash sprayer provide sufficient water pressure?
That depends. We've actually had a cooperative car wash, boat wash program before we could get our decontamination. And a number of the car washes do have pressure of a high enough intensity to effectively spray. I think the issue is the temperature. because they might turn the temperature down on those units so that there's no injury to the individual using the self-serve units. Some of the ones that are sort of the auto that you go through, those are slightly higher temperature and can effectively wash off the outside of boats. It doesn't have the duration that we would usually use. But the other tricky part to remember is those technologies don't typically flush the internal compartments, and that's often where that residual water is that we need to get out of the motor and the bilge and the live wells and ballast tanks.
Great. Okay, we'll do one more, just one more, and then we'll let you go. Sorry. So I'm a student at Pulsmiths who just moved here from California. In California, we have a law where to get into any lake or body of water, you have to have your boat and trailer literally tagged saying it is clear to enter that body of water, as well as the watercraft and trailer have to be completely dry or you are denied access in order to control the spread of invasive species. Does New York have a program like this?
Yes, on Lake George, but only on Lake George, where the Park Commission controls all points of entry into that body of water. One of the biggest differences in watercraft inspection and decontamination programs across the country is out west. There are many more large reservoirs and bodies of water that are surrounded predominantly by federal lands. And there are large programs that have been set up for these specific mandatory inspection and decontamination programs that you're referring to. And they're largely pushed in that direction as a result of the threat of spread of zebra and quagga mussels from the Great Lakes overland to the western states. So those programs were all founded on the basis of trying to prevent the introduction of zebra and quagga mussels. Unfortunately and fortunately for us, just in our geographic landscape, we literally have thousands of little lakes across the landscape. And we have no way to really patrol or to check that all boats are inspected and decontaminated before they launch or after they retrieve. So we're kind of implementing a hybrid model here where on Lake George, there is a mandatory program because it can be implemented there. And for the Adirondack Park and Lake Champlain and other New England states, there's combinations of volunteer inspection programs that are targeted at the highest use lakes or at the lakes that are of highest ecological significance.
Thanks, Megan. So I think we'll call that the last question. A lot of great questions, and Meg, I really, on behalf of everybody on the Zoom call or webinar, really thank you for your expertise and your presentation. Really rich with information, and you could tell by the range of questions that folks are really engaged with it. So really appreciate it, and I know you've got a